are still joining. So this session is now being recorded. So just so that everybody is aware that the session is being recorded. So my name is Louise Ryan, and I'm a senior professor here at London Metropolitan University. And you are all very welcome to tonight's book launch, which is being hosted by the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre. And I'd like to begin by wishing you all a very happy Cinco de Mayo. And I'm taking some credit for this, actually, because when Maria and I were discussing the launch of this wonderful book, I did suggest that the Cinco de Mayo would be a really nice evening in which to have the book launch. So here we are in this special occasion in Mexico, celebrating via London Metropolitan University. So I'm very pleased to be chairing the session here, and I'd also like to thank our colleague Anna from the Research Office, who provides all the support in the background. So the book we are launching tonight is Gender Violence in 21st Century Latin American Women's Writings. And we are delighted to, oh, and you can see Maria's holding up a copy of the book. Congratulations to Maria and Stephen. So we are now going to have short presentations from the three speakers. So if I could ask the audience members to please hold back their questions. You can type your questions in the chat, or at the end of the three speakers' presentations, you can then put your hand up and we can invite you to turn your microphone on and speak. So the three speakers that we will be hearing from tonight are Stephen Hart, who is Professor of Latin American Film, Literature and Culture at University College London. My colleague, Maria Lopez, who's Reader in Sociology and Deputy Director of the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre here at London Metropolitan University. And Deborah Ann Castillo, who is the Stephen H. Weiss Presidential Fellow and Emerson Hinchcliffe Professor of Hispanic Studies at Cornell University in New York. And we're very pleased to invite, to welcome Deborah to our centre here this evening, all the way from New York. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Maria, who'll tell you a bit about the book and then introduce the three speakers. Maria.
Thank you, Louise. Very, very kind of you. And can you all hear me with no echo? Yes, I understand. Okay, so thank you everybody for attending today's event. We are so pleased to have you all here, and we're so pleased to do this launch tonight and talk a bit about this book, which we've written during the pandemic, and that was really painful for all of us, really, for Stephen and I. So there is a lot going on with this book, and we'll go, and I'm sure Stephen will have the opportunity to talk a bit about it in his presentation, and I talk about a bit about mine too. But just I think Stephen will agree with me if I say that this book came as a result of a conversation we had in his office one casual afternoon. He was my PhD supervisor, so I used to, yeah, every now and then go and visit him and have a chat about what we both are doing. And we talked about how women, the violence in Latin America was so silenced. We hardly heard about it in this part of the world, other than, you know, those people who, like me or like him, we are very interested, or we are in this academic, doing these academic activities and research. So we decided, why not? Well, we should be really writing a book about violence against women. So that was the, just to give a voice to those women and look into that literature and those authors. So that is how we decided to start this book that we are presenting today. So we invited Deborah Castillo, and I'm handing over her now. She is an expert in Latin American studies and in literature, in Hispanic literature. She is, as we call it, a big name on that. And so Stephen just proposed her to come to today's lounge for her to talk a bit about our book. So without further ado, I'm passing that to her. She will talk about the book first, her views on that. Then Stephen will talk about that sort of mixture that we tried to present today in this book. And we're presented today about this sort of mixture about social science and literature. And then I will talk about the violence against women, the increase of violence against women in the Latin American region and the Caribbean during the pandemic and how it has increased, and how more than ever is so needed to talk about these issues. So Deborah, I'm passing that to you. I'm looking forward to listen to your views about the book.
Well, thank you so much, Maria, and thank you for inviting me here to London, and thank you and congrats to Stephen and Maria on this important and desperately timely book. I want to cast our mind back a couple of years ago to the summer of 2019 in Valparaiso, Chile, when the Valparaiso-based group Las Tesis went viral on the world's social networks with their flash mob performance of El Violador en tu Camino, or The Rapist in Your Path. The short protest performance was replicated in public events in Chile, all across Latin America, and it was translated into many languages as it was performed in plazas in over 50 countries around the world. The simple, effective choreography, the chant, the green and purple clothing, and the black bands across the participants' eyes all combined to transmit a strong message of strong women standing up for their rights against violence and human rights violations. This particular performance was taken so seriously that women of the collective were officially condemned by Chilean authorities for, quote, inciting violence against the police. And as the flash mob went viral worldwide, the hashtag women's movement group Ni Una Menos reported that 7 women were arrested in Turkey just for participating. On the other end of the continent, in August of 2019, young feminist leaders in Mexico were exchanging recipes for eco-conscious pink glitter to fling on public officials in what came to be called the glitter revolution. These were demonstrations that were also bringing attention to the state's unresponsiveness to the burgeoning issue of violence against women. Later, about a year later, in early September 2020, the Frente Nacional Ni Una Menos occupied the National Human Rights Commission building in Mexico City and turned it into a women's shelter. This is the context for Stephen Hart and Maria Lopez's important new book, Gender Violence in 21st Century Latin American Women's Writing, which we are celebrating today. They look at recent literary texts from Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, Argentina, and Chile, and richly contextualize these mostly fictional works with respect to historical, social, and legal backgrounds in these 5 countries. Their study samples of the rich variety of the ways feminist thinkers and writers are working creatively to amplify and channel their message to political actors and civic society at large. I think very few of us from any disciplinary background these days would ask why they chose to address such difficult topics through fiction. I know in my university, and perhaps yours as well, my colleagues in history, sociology, psychology, anthropology, science and technology studies, and even international agriculture regularly include fiction, film, and other media as essential core texts in their courses. As Lopez and Hart note in this book, the term femicide is generally attributed to the feminist thinker and activist Diana Russell, who began using it in the mid-1970s to describe the intentional murder of women and girls. About 20 years ago, Rosalinda Fregoso and Cynthia Bejarano added an important elaboration. Building on the generic definition of femicide as the murder of women and girls because they are female, they define feminicide as the murders of women and girls founded on a gender power structure. So the distinction they make is that feminicide is gender-based violence that is both public and private, implicating the state directly or indirectly, as well as individual perpetrators. This is something that Hart and Lopez pick up on through their reference to this concept of feminicide in the fundamental work of Juarez scholar Julia Monares. Thus, while femicide points to an individual crime, feminicide is a structural social dysfunction. The central issue that this distinction from the generic term homicide addresses has been the way that patriarchal social structures continue to permit violence against women, treat such violence with scant concern, and allow perpetrators to continue to circulate in society with impunity. As Hart and Lopez note, it makes accurate record keeping hard to find. It makes stories difficult to tell, since they are pushed aside or marginalized. The 7-year-old child or the 90-year-old woman, the person easily brushed aside as just another prostitute, just another queer or trans person, or just another woman of color from a poor barrio where violence is presumed to be endemic. For many feminist activists and writers like those explored in this book, this violence is not primarily due to a breakdown in social mores. Rather, it's a continuance of millennia-long structures in society, structures that subordinate women and devalue their lives, structures that are finally being more actively questioned as their inner workings are forcibly pushed into the public limelight. All of us are aware of the even greater urgency of this issue in COVID times. Hart and Lopez reference this as their book went to press in the second year of the pandemic. Early reports suggest, and I know Maria will talk more about this, that domestic violence has increased by 30% since the pandemic. Last time I checked, there were 155 calls an hour to sexual abuse hotlines in Mexico. That's almost 4,000 reports a day. Is this a failed state issue? Or, as the many protesters against gender violence across the world have suggested, evidence of a state that is all too successful in masking and maintaining a horrendous status quo? This inaction, as US legal scholar Deborah Rode so incisively analyzed years ago, protects a complex legal code written by and for dominant culture men. While we know, and we all know this, that approximately 80% of the people murdered in the world today are men, approximately 50 to 60,000 women, trans women, and girls have been killed every year, whether by strangers or intimate relations. As Hart and Lopez remind us, of the countries with the highest rates of feminicides in the world, unfortunately, a disproportionate number of them have for years been located in Latin America, including shameful representatives among the top 10 countries as the most violent countries for women in the world. A revolving list that currently includes Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, along with Bolivia and the Dominican Republic. We need to remember as well that in many countries, record keeping is sparse and uneven. Legal definitions of feminicide vary, and information is confused by complicated bureaucratic structures that often intentionally obfuscate information. Thus, for instance, many feminists are deeply concerned about the current situation in Venezuela, where the civil unrest in the country makes record keeping practically impossible. And at the same time, despite what I've just said, it's surely important not to demonize the global South and to keep in mind the larger context in which, according to my latest Google search the other day in any case, Botswana is #1 in rape stats in the world, but Australia is #2. Books like Gender Violence in the 21st Century Latin American Women's Writing help amplify crucial voices and engage a deeper understanding of this challenging time. Yet it can only capture a particular moment in this continuing tragedy and a tiny slice of a continent-wide issue. In Chile, Las Tesis continues its active live and Instagram campaign despite censorship by local authorities and social media platforms. In Guatemala, queer feminist hip-hop MC Rebecca Lane expresses her rage at a country with one of the world's worst human rights records for women and LGBTQI people. In her Ni Una Menos, performed around the world with the Somos Guerreras collective she founded, she raps, "Quisiera tener cosas dulces que escribir, pero tengo que decidir y me decido por la rabia." I would like to have sweet things to write, but today I have to decide, and I decide for rage. During the COVID epidemic, Rebecca Lane published her first book of poetry, sponsored a September 2020 convocation of 21 femcs and rappers from 9 countries in the Cypher 2 performance. You can find it available for free download from SoundCloud. She gave birth to her daughter Valentina, released the album Florecer, and is now touring internationally again. In Argentina, Patricia Salgado continues her decades-long commitment with the Madres de Plaza de Mayo through theatrical work that focuses on the dramatic interpretation of that human rights struggle. Her short, Ella en Familia, is about the savage social structures that permit transphobia and dismiss the feminicide of trans people. Meanwhile, here in Ithaca, New York, my collaborator Ana Florencia Lopez Ulloa and I, along with a talented and dedicated pair of community members, actresses, have spent the COVID years polishing a play inspired by the Glitter Revolution, Diamantina Rosa Se Vale Bailar, on the social structures that permit continued violence against women in Latin America. We just finished a successful regional tour of live performances and are looking forward to touring the play in Mexico next summer. As artists and scholars across the hemisphere find creative ways to continue their important social justice work before, during, after COVID, we in turn are sharpening our ethical questions, framing testimonial narratives, and helping make visible the ongoing struggle for women's rights in the hemisphere. I find many points of dialogue with Hart and Lopez's book, and it continues to be a difficult reminder of the work that we all have ahead of us as well. Thank you so much again for inviting me, and I turn it back to Maria.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you so much. So I guess thank you so much. You make me think a lot about these things that we've been discussing for 2 or 3 years, Stephen and I. Stephen, I pass that to you. So
okay.
So yeah. There you go.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just wanted to say to everyone, I'm really sorry about the fact that I can't seem to get my camera to work at the moment, and apologies for that. But many thanks to everyone for attending this book launch today. It really is a great honor to be here, and a special thanks to Metropolitan University for hosting this book launch. And thank you also, Deborah, for your advocacy for social justice in all its forms in the New World, as well as in Europe and all over the world, and also for the way that you've spearheaded the discourse about women's lives, about women's writing. You've always been an inspiration for me, and I remember those many years ago when you allowed me to come to Cornell to talk a little bit about women's writing, and that was such a marvelous space that you allowed for myself to talk about women's writing. So when I published my book in 1993 called White Ink, which was inspired, as you would imagine, by Virginia Woolf, I was looking at literature from a very sort of literary studies point of view, and that's only to be expected, I suppose, at the time. And what I wanted to do was to look at sexual politics, and it was quite clear to me that there were 2 writers, a number of writers, but certainly in Latin America, Marta Traba and Luisa Valenzuela came forward as 2 writers that I wanted to find out more about. Now we need to remember that at that time, I think it's probably fair to say, I don't know if Deborah would agree with me, but the Hispanic canon was pretty masculinist. It was masculinocentric. So there were quite a few male writers, and you had to fight a little bit to bring in female writers. There were obviously the obvious ones like Sor Juana, and Gertrudis de Avellaneda, etc. There are numbers, Rosario Castellanos. But, you know, it was a bit of an uphill struggle in some ways. But certainly what interested me at that time was looking at works like Conversación al Sur, 1981, the Mothers and Shadows, and also Cambio de Armas, Other Weapons of 1982. I saw very much how they're powerful and uncomfortable visions of how sex and politics could inform each other, and they treated as well some uncomfortable themes such as femicide, delirium, paranoia, and sexual torture. So I was very interested at that time in kind of reintegrating. This was probably in the literary studies sense, but some of those themes stayed with me. And then I remember just before lockdown, really, Maria and I were talking about some of these issues, and she more or less said to me, Stephen, why haven't you written on women writers since then? And I said, well, I think others are far better qualified than myself, including, I might add, Deborah Castillo. So that I feel that perhaps I did say something at that point which was able to suggest ways in which one could integrate the in the canon, but it was a canon idea. And so she said, well, I don't find that convincing. Let's think about ways in which we could write a book together. And so I'd just like to say thank you to Maria for forcing me to write this book, for encouraging me to write this book, and also for suggesting some books that I could look at, and also reading our works together. What I would say is different about this book is that times have moved on, and one can talk about activism in the arts and humanities a bit more. One can talk, as I think Deborah did very eloquently at the beginning, about the choreographing of dramatic incidences in order to show the injustice that women suffer in the modern day world. And it's not just that they suffer the injustice, it's that the injustice itself is not recognized as injustice, or in other words, the way that it's portrayed within the media and within certain institutions does not give it the gravity that it deserves. And so in some ways, this was the challenge that Maria put to me. And what I wanted to do in my part of the book, so I'll just talk a little bit about that, is to look at two issues. Again, the uncomfortable themes are there: femicide, delirium, paranoia, sexual torture. Those are issues which are talked about in these works. And I wanted to talk about the value of literature, because at the time when I wrote the earlier book, I wasn't necessarily questioning the value of literature. But as time has gone on, I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of people have begun to question the value of literature. And so what I wanted to do was to say, okay, if we question the value of literature, why would it be that, let's say, the legal facts, sociological facts, sociology of those discourses, why would we say that they're more valuable than, let's say, literature? And what is it that literature has? And so I really started from the idea of it being a complementary exercise. So one of the ways of doing this was to sort of look at the way that sociology, this was just an example, a kind of a thought experiment. And I'm not going to really run through all the ideas related to that, but I thought that one could draw a difference between the social sciences, which looks at data, which looks at numbers, which looks at crime records, and produces a panoramic and empiric vision of what is happening, let's say, in acts of violence against women in various countries via a number of studies. And beside that, you could say, what does literature do? So what I wanted to do was to ask that question, and I said that what does its creative qualitative approach have that some of those other studies don't have? And here is more or less the conclusion I had, which I'm sure Deborah would say is quite simplistic. And I think it probably is a bit simplistic, but I think that literature and film and the creative, qualitative approach can make you feel like you're there. In other words, it can allow our experience, however uncomfortable that experience is, that the writer, when writing a literary work, can take you back in time or can take you into the future, but can allow you to experience something that happened and can make that point in a way which relates to the activist humanities. And so therefore, what I wanted to do in this study was to look at the different types of ways in which literature can reconstruct events of violence against women. And I looked at one of them was the empirical reconstruction of a violent event against a woman or women. Number 2 was the imaginative recreation of a violent event against a woman, about which, for legal reasons, the author is unable to provide the actual names of the perpetrators, but we can work them out, as it were. And the number 3 would be the non-empirical ideation of a violent event against a woman or women that is based on and distilled from a number of informational sources. So I just came up with these ideas and I proposed them as a hypothesis. Coming back to that, I then asked myself the question, and we did this, Maria and ourselves, thinking about this, is that what can literature do in order to change things? And I suggested in a modest suggestion that there is sometimes a case when in those countries in which they've held, for example, truth commissions about violence against women and against men for political reasons, countries such as Argentina, such as Chile, such as Uruguay and Peru, that the Truth Commission actually has an important function to play within society and allows people to understand what has happened in the past. And while it can't bring those people back, it can at least allow us to have a sense in which, if certain individuals are punished, that justice can be done. What I found is that in a country such as Colombia, where there hasn't been quite the same national commission or truth or reconciliation report, although there have been a number of attempts at that in a sense what happened with these novelists that we were studying is that they saw this as their chance, as it were, to take on the role of the missing Truth Commission. In other words, to tell the story about the things that have happened to women in such a way that they should be recognized in the way that they would have in kind of a Truth Commission would normally do. So this was one of the points that emerged. I know this is rather contentious, but it seemed to me to suggest and explain why there was that urgency within some of the works that we looked at. What I wanted to do was just to talk about those two things. In other words, the interplay between sociology as a social science and between the creative, qualitative approach that we find within literature, which allows us to enter into that world in a way which is very different from the social sciences, but has its own value, and also to emphasize that we are therefore edging towards, in this book, towards activism within the arts and humanities, because what we want people to do when they read this book is to say these things should not have happened, they should not happen again in the future. I understand what has happened here. We have entered into the minds of individuals here. This must stop. So therefore, we see our book in terms of that plea or scream or shout that these things should stop. So just to say thank you very much for listening to my points there, and again very much following in Deborah Castillo's footsteps there. Some of the ways in which she has initiated and created the film and the field of feminist Latin American studies, and also kind of reinvented the idea of talking back, which is such a wonderful term that she brought into the public arena in the 1980s and 1990s. Sorry, not the 1890s. I nearly said there, but okay. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much. It's been great to listen to you and this interplay between literary studies and social science. So I'm gonna share my presentation with you, the one I want to do with you, because and it reminds me that this idea we just explored in your room at UCL when we talked about how we wanted to write a book to give back the voice to women and to recognize the big effort these writers were doing while writing and the stories of those women, those very particular stories, who in many cases were autobiographical, but in others they were telling the stories of others who didn't have the chance to write or didn't know how to tell their story. So today, and after conversation with Deborah and Stephen before Easter, I decided to, today I'll be talking about the violence against women in COVID time, and how, which Deborah just mentioned a bit in her presentation. So this is the starting point, we'll come back to this in a minute. This is the starting point for our book. Just with some data and some stuff that I want to share with you, and then I will move to the situation in Mexico. But it very much applied to all the countries that Stephen and I have looked into this book. So in Latin America, 1 in 3 women suffer gender-based violence, according to the World Bank. And Deborah and Stephen, I think you will agree with me if I say that the data on that is immense. We keep on checking data on a weekly basis, and the data we get is more and more worrying. This data has increased to 1 in 3 women that we know, the 1 in 3 women who have reported violence against them. I've reported that, so we don't from institutions. Face violence, whether they should be safe first in their own homes. Today, I appeal for peace in homes around the world. I urge all governments to put women's safety first as they respond to the pandemic. So he is making clear reference to 2 things that have been said today in this presentation. This is when we talk about violence against women in this particular context, we're talking about the violence perpetrated by institutions and governments to women, not physically, although we'll say that there is some instances in which this happen, police forces and governments. but just allowing this to happen without putting all the resources or creating the clear indications or clear guidelines or laws to protect women. And also something which this makes reference to something that we've said in this presentation. This is something perpetrated, allowed by governments and institutions. So we really need to, this is an urgency, there is an urgency for all governments to stop and respond to this pandemic, which is the gender violence. So this creates a lot of conversations and discussions in academia and also in other spheres. So there was, when the COVID-19 happened, there was a clash of two different pandemics in Latin America and the Caribbean. There was a major increase, double in some cases, of domestic violence and feminicide in Latin America during the stay-at-home guidelines. So this book, and I think Stephen would agree with me if I say it's been very difficult to write because there are many different types of violence against women. And plus, the situation for women in different countries is so difficult. When we talk about domestic violence, for instance, in this example, we're leaving behind so many different types of violence affecting women or impacting women. For example, in Colombia, let's gonna get the calls to domestic violence helplines. In Colombia, the calls to domestic violence helpline increased by 91%. In Mexico, 36%, in 1 year only. In Argentina, where 7 out of 10 murders of women happen at home, emergency calls for domestic violence increased by 25%. And Bolivia, which we didn't address in this book, but the situation is horrible for women there, reported the highest number of cases of domestic violence and feminicides in South America. This, as I said before, it's likely to be much higher, this incidence, because it's been reported or fewer than 40% of women report a crime or seek help of any kind. Many women, and I was talking about that with a student yesterday, many women don't even realize that what they're suffering is gender violence. Nobody has ever told them that this is what it is, that they're suffering gender violence or violence against women. There is an urgency of continuing effort to empower women by enhancing, and that is something that we've tried to do in this book, their voice and agency. Because what Stephen and I have tried to do in this book is give a voice, replicate the voice of these very famous and very well-known writers in some areas, just replicate and enhance their voice in different areas, and also their agency. What are they fighting for in their novels, in their stories, in their writing? They're fighting violence against women. They're fighting to remove barriers impeding women's ownership over their bodies. And I'm thinking now about Claudia Piñero, for example, in Argentina. She's very aware, she's very focused on fighting against or preventing teen pregnancies and how dangerous it is in a country where the free to abortion has been just approved months ago in Argentina. They want to secure successful school to work transitions and remove constraints to more and better employment for women. And then I remember, Stephen, that conversation we had together when we talked about how women and feminists, scholars and activists in Latin America were fighting or were protesting death gap against death gap, while in Europe and in other parts of the world, feminists were fighting or protesting the gap in salaries, etc. How they were in Latin American activists were fighting and for a human rights thing, and in some cases they were putting their own lives in danger. So I'm just gonna focus on Mexico now and try to make some reference to the other countries. Mexico is the country that I'm researching about at the minute, and although there is a chapter on Mexico, and I was really impressed by the work of one of the writers, who is Fernanda Melchor, and her novel Temporada de Huracanes, Hurricane Seasons. I was really impressed by that. That was the last chapter I did, and I was really impressed about this woman and how she very well reproduces and talks and writes about the violence against women. And as Deborah mentioned, transsexuals and transgenders. This is a huge problem too that we also talk about in our book. So the violence against Mexico under COVID-19, just want to call your attention about something which happened in International Women's Day March in Mexico City on the 8th of March this year. More than 3,000 police women surrounded thousands of people who were protesting. And they were protesting everyday normalized violence against women. And we have addressed this issue throughout the whole book, Stephen and I. The normalized, when the violence against women is a normal practice. So only in 2020, at least 10 women were killed per day in Mexico, of which 940 cases only were investigated as gender-related. The rest were in a different box, in a homicide, suicide, and all different kind of, but no gender-related. And the National Institute of Statistics and Geography in Mexico reported that under confinement measures, over 70% of women feel at risk in their daily lives. 20% of women over 18 feel insecurity at home, and 23.2% of females' homicides occur there. So Arosi Unda, who is a very famous and well-known activist, a Mexico feminist activist, said, "Women are the gatekeepers of our crumbling country. Yet we are the ones being assassinated, raped, disappeared, bought, and sold by traffickers." They were also protesting against the big challenges, other big challenges in Mexico, huge impunity. So it's surprisingly, and Deborah will know about it too, and Stephen, Mexico ranks the first for the highest levels of impunity in the whole area, the whole region, and the fourth worldwide. So that means that 96% of cases of violence against women are abandoned and the perpetrators are left free. So there is a huge problem with the silence over the issue. Women are presented as collateral victims, no central victims, of ... or the war on drugs, machismo, patriarchy, whatever, but just victims. They are not addressed as central. The violence against women is not addressed as a central issue, but as collateral to other many important issues. So women are tired, and they protest against being told that the violence against women is not a big deal. This is something that Stephen and I have addressed throughout the book. That is precisely what we've done. We've located the violence against women at the center of discussion. And then we've moved the rest to other sides of the sides of the problem. Women are central of these realities. Women are central, women writers and the stories of women and the voices for women. And I'm thinking now about the Cuban writers. How Cuban writers, they are just obsessed with recovering the voice and rewriting the story of Cuba and locating those women revolutionaries in the center of these fights that took Castro into power. There is a lack of governmental support, and that is what they are protesting. Where is the government? So I just created this just to give you an idea how is my mindset when writing about this. And Stephen, you remember when we talked about the violence against women, and you came out with this idea. This is the skeleton in the closet, and I laughed a lot about it, but I love the idea. This is in the introduction of the book. This is the skeleton in the closet. This is something that nobody seems to be addressing, or they are very reluctant to address from an institutional perspective. This skeleton in the closet is perpetuated by the government and the state forces in many ways. I'm not going into detail. In each country is in a different way, and that is what I refer to as institutional machismo. This is a machismo that is coming from institutions, from governments, from state forces. This is sustained in dysfunctional public policies to prevent or protect women or eradicate violence. showing a lack of resources and specialized personnel, clear protocols, and a terminology even among federal states, national states, local states, everywhere. There is not an agreement on what feminicide is, what femicide is, what murder is, etc. This is sustained also in a complicit society led by long-standing prejudices against women that leads in many occasions to victims be criminalized and re-victimized, and even families blamed for what has happened to women. And this is all embedded in a patriarchal and machista ideology in the region, but also, as Deborah pointed out very, very rightly, not only in the global south or not only in the Latin American and Caribbean region, but in many, many parts of the northern, on the northern side of the world. And around all this is a silencing of women who, as I said before, they are presented as collateral victims of more important problems for the present and for the others. And I'll go into that in a minute. So what is institutional machismo that we've been writing about throughout the book? This is coming throughout the book in many, many different ways, depending on the country, depending on the context. This institutional machismo reproduces from institutions male chauvinism, ignores critical women's issues like gender-based violence, but many other things too. And as I said before, it presents those women as collateral victims of in Mexico, war on drugs, but many other things. Silences authorities' inefficient management of the cases, promotes negative stereotypes about women, like sexual objects and cheap labor. I'm thinking now about the northern border of Mexico, cheap labor in the maquiladoras, from which men can and should benefit if they can. And it justifies the violent police protocols against women and the feminist movements, and legitimizes male power overall. The police and military and judicial system over women. So what do? Women on risk of violence, most of them, they do not take their cases to court because, and I find these quotes very funny, it's not important, they've got fear for the kids, shame and public shame, do not know they can report, they don't even know, do not trust the authorities, etc. I'm thinking now about Argentina and all these, and the book by Dead Girls, the Chicas Muertas, and which is about feminicide of girls and the cases abandoned in rural Argentina. Very good book. So how does it translate into the law? There is cuts in the legal support for the victims of violence. In Mexico, in 2021, during the pandemic, there was a cancellation of the federal budget for the gender violence alert against women in states with the highest rates of violence against women. Mexico State, Veracruz, Nueva León, Mexico City, Puebla, and Jalisco, all gone. So the gender violence alert enabled quick intervention from the police and the judicial system in assaults and murders of women. Now they don't have any funding. So in April 2021, Housing for Indigenous and Afro-Descendant Women and the National Network for Shelters for Women Victims of Violence lost state financial support too. And there is a big debate and discussion in the country. So where is this money going, and why, again, women are just located at the sides of the issue? So I'm talking just a bit about this, just giving you just brief examples about the institutional machismo, how this manifests in the discourse and in the discourse by the president of Mexico. And Deborah and Stephen may know about it because it's been on papers, and it is on papers all day. So there is a clear and direct hostile environment from the government to women, and particularly the feminist movement in Mexico. Just in May 2020, AMLO, so the president, López Obrador, he's been called AMLO, questioned his own cabinet's notice that emergency call centers had processed over 26,000 reports of violence against women in 1 month only, in March 2020. He questioned that, and he suggested that all these emergency calls were a fake. This is in The Guardian. September 2021, AMLO said that feminism is a conservative movement created 2 years ago to awaken his political project. That happened in 2021, last year. It's been just created 2 years ago. March 2022, just this year, AMLO notified that the International Women's Day March would be violent, and he encouraged people not to attend because that was led by violent peoples and people who were just trying to destabilize the system and his government. So women and feminists, they proclaim themselves, they've been proclaimed by media, not only in Mexico, but in the whole area, in the whole region, as the voice of the opposition. Several feminist groups accuse the Mexican government in the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights for using a patriarchal and repressive regulatory framework that criminalizes and abuses women activists with illegal detentions and physical and sexual abuse by the police. It's been taken by the from Amnesty International. So Tania Reneaum Pance, who is the executive director at Amnesty International Mexico, said during the arrests and transfers, police officers spoke to the women using violent and sexualized language, threatened them with sexual violence, and subjected them to physical and sexual violence. So again, another strong manifestation of institutional violence against women. The authorities stigmatize feminists as violent to discredit their activism and question their motives. And they use illegal force to silence them and to silence their protests. So they restrict also women's right assembly and justify public threats and assaults against them in all spheres. So that is the reason why those women, our women writers, our selected group of women writers, they, that is why their work is so important. And that is why we really need to look at that, because it's so contemporary. Some writers, some stories that we address in this book, they look at the situation back in the 80s, back in the 90s, but they are very contemporary, and this is a very urgent thing to look at their work and listen to them and read them and reflect on what they want to tell us. And you know, overall, just to give the women the voice, to just preserve their voice and their agency. That is what they do. They raise awareness about violence against women as a form of institutional machismo. It's not something that is happening at social level only, but it's very well, it's sometimes in a different ways. It's very much protected by governments and institutions. So there is a common thesis, there is a common hypothesis that violence from governments and state forces is a breeding ground for female discrimination, feminicide, and sexual abuse. And these writers, invite us to rethink the notions of gender, the subaltern, the other. Who's the other? Citizenship, the female body, which is throughout the whole book, the body and how important women's body are, the state, the global market, the price of women's bodies in the global market. And as Stephen mentioned, this book is halfway between sociology, a sociological and literary approach, but our approach is very much in line with women's studies and feminism. So that's it. That's all I had to say in this intervention. This is a bit of bibliography that I'm very happy to pass to those who want to, who may be interested in this. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you to Stephen and Deborah. So that was a very full discussion of the content of the book, but also contextualizing the book within the specific situation in the Global South, particularly in Latin America, but also bringing it up to date with the pandemic. So I found that was particularly an interesting addition to your work, Maria. So thank you as well for sharing that information. So I have to confess, this is not an area on which I have any great knowledge. So I'm learning all the time, and I'm always interested in hearing what Maria has to say about this topic. So I would really like to throw the floor open to questions now, because I know there are people in the audience who know a lot more about this topic than I do. So at the moment, I don't see any questions in the chat, but I must confess I had a technical issue at one point, and I had to log off and log on again. And when I logged off and logged on again, I lost the previous chat. So apologies if anybody had typed a question in the chat. I can't see that any longer. If there aren't any questions in the chat, I would now invite people to please formulate their questions. Or if you don't want to be laboriously typing out your question in the chat, you can simply put your hand up and ask your question in person. So are there any immediate questions or comments that people would like to share with the speakers? Okay, well, maybe while people are thinking about their question, I can ask a question. I was really intrigued by an observation, I think that it was Stephen who made, about the ways in which we rely on sort of qualitative social research to research these very hard to discuss topics, and then the ways in which writers and fiction writers can use the cultural sphere to explore these topics. So I just wondered if you could have a short reflection while people are thinking of their questions about the ways in which, as Maria has said, we can kind of bring together sociological research with novels and literature as a way of getting insights into these very sensitive and very difficult topics. Would anybody like to take that up? Maybe not all three, so we can save a bit of time.
I mean, I don't mind coming in there. Thanks very much for that, Louise, that point. I mean, in some ways, this kind of came up from, you know, the idea that somebody said to me once, well, you know, you're hardly going to get someone to be put on trial as a result of a novel. You know, so and it's kind of obvious, really. So, and one of the points about that was that, you know, literature it has a role in terms of this imaginative recreation of a world, but it can't be, as it were, something that can be pressed into duty at a you know, at a court case. But you know, things such as police testimonials or you know, evidence given in court, you know, visual evidence which is on cameras, all these sorts of things are part of the, you know, the everyday stuff of criminality, of proving criminality. So you know, that was one of the questions which came up. Well, what role does it play in this? You know, so I tried to suggest that there were ways, and it might have been a bit of a weak kind of hypothesis, but really that if you think about it, in a book group, sometimes people say, I get this, I understand this issue now because of this novel, and I've read about it in the newspapers, and I know some of these things are going on, but to read this novel allows me to enter into that world. So I'm not really saying much more, I'm afraid, than what I said before. Okay, you got here some English novels that write about violence against women. Probably Deborah will be pretty good on that one. I mean, there's quite a few. You could even say Jane Austen actually talks about against
Jane
Austen. And you know, so we could go back even that far actually.
But I wasn't sure if the question actually referred to if these novels that you're talking about are published in English. Was that the question, or was it that looking for English novels? Hong, would you
That
be able
was
to
exactly
clarify
the
your
question I was going to say, because if it's British novels, I actually don't have a very good sense at all. But if it's novels or texts in English, I think we all have lots of suggestions, both things that are from the perspective of English-speaking authors in the wider range of English-speaking writers between the U.S. and and Africa and South Asia, or writers translated into English, which is also another huge body of writers. So that's a very big question, Nguyen. So you have to come up with perhaps more specific.
Well, maybe Hung, you could clarify your question, but while you're doing that, could we go back to Natalie? Natalie was asking a question here. Natalie Sweeney, is there any evidence about whether cultural change or legislative change is the more effective in reducing violence against women? That's another big question. I don't know who'd like to have a go at that one first.
Yeah, I can give it a go. Natalie, it's a very, very difficult question. We don't really know, and it's very difficult to quantify and to prove. What we know is that in those areas in which, and in those countries where there is a gender politics, that means that the authorities really take into account the situation of women, or they apply a gender perspective to issues, that solutions and investigations are more effective than in those places in which there is no gender perspective, women are not taken into consideration, or there are no gender-based approach to those issues, conflict, assassinations or aggressions, violence, etc. That is one thing. So, and then on the cultural side, a cultural change, well, if you protect women on various spheres, on the legislative side and also the political side, etc., there will be slowly a cultural change. But this is a very, very difficult question and a very difficult topic that you will find very different answers to. Some people do believe that the education on a gender perspective is really key to have a secure, let's say, secure society for women and a fair society for women. Others don't think that the question is that, but we really need to look into what's happening at intrafamiliar in that area. So it's a very difficult. I don't think I can say that. But what I would strongly recommend is just to add that gender perspective into the governance of countries, areas, etc. Yeah.
Thank you, Maria. Perhaps we could direct the next question to Deborah. This is a question from Hannah. Can you see the chat, Deborah? For various Latin American female authors. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great.
So I can just respond directly. Stephen, I think you have your microphone on, and that's why you keep popping in and out. So that just mentioning that. So yes, Laura Restrepo, the Colombian writer, and Christina Rivera Garza from Mexico, two very great writers and very, very highly recognized. I could also add to that people like Carmen Bullosa, who lives, in New York City, or Valeria Luiselli, who also lives in New York City. And I think one of the things that the contemporary environment has allowed for is something that is quite different from what our understanding of national literature and the appeal of authors to a particular national audience has been in the past. The most well-received authors right now are transnational authors, not ones who speak only to a national audience. And I think, just to take one example that you've named, Christina Rivera Garza is an excellent example. Christina is originally from the border area, lived in the center of Mexico, and is now a professor in Houston, Texas, where she is the director of a new creative writing program. And I think it's, it's a particularly good example because she just recently received one of the most significant awards that anyone can get in the United States, which is the Macarthur Award, which is often called the Genius Award, which has given her even more prominence. She was already very prominent and very well known within Latin America. And Christina really does define herself, as does Carmen Bullosa and several other, Valeria as well, as writers who are transnational writers, writers who speak within that wider audience. And they absolutely are the authors that are the most distributed, the most well-known right now among authors in Latin America, men or women. So I would say it's not causing them any problems. And with authors at that level, there's also immediate translation, which means that they also have access to audiences in many, many other languages, including English.
Thank you. Can I just add something about Christina Rivera Garza? She is one of our partners in one of our applications. We did just apply for a networking grant application. Christina, very much agreed to be one of our partners. And she's written, as you know, Deborah, this book about the femicide of her sister, which I just finished a couple of weeks ago. And this is just very interesting because even as you said, she's not living in Mexico, but she is one of those writers who is very, apart from the fact that she's highly recognized, and she's very humble and very nice, as you know. And she is one of those who is really focused and really in trying to give a voice to women and to talk for women, but also talk for those who are killed, as her own sister who was killed, and she was killed by her boyfriend, etc. So she's one of those she would be in one of in the group that we just selected for this book. She is obsessed with giving a voice, and I've got a couple of books about necropolitics that she's written about. She writes very well, and she's really obsessed with giving back the voice to women. So in that networking application that we did, she said, yes, I'm very interested in being part of this networking thing and just giving a voice. So I'm glad that she came into this discussion today, because she's very reputed, and even if she's not living in Mexico, she's very much in contact with Mexico and traveling back and forth all the time and having the experience of crossing the border, which she can't stop writing about. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you, Maria. And fingers crossed we get that networking grant. We should all send positive vibes for our grant application. I don't see any further questions in the chat, though. Hung is asking for recommendations of particular novels written in the English language. So if anybody would like to type any suggestions in the English language in the chat, then I think that would be appreciated. Are there any other questions? Would anybody like to turn? Okay, thank you, Deborah.
I just added something else, which was because people were talking about multidisciplinary work. And so I just gave you an example of a website which is related to a project that I did just before COVID with people from Venezuela, Ecuador, Mexico, Colombia, and also locally, ranging from engineering to film to indigenous activism. And it was around our relationship to water, and part of it involved also working with local communities and an NGO on capacity building for women leaders in these very rural communities, so that they could have more of a voice in participating in decisions related to water use. So that's a very, very interdisciplinary project, but it is an example of some of the kinds of things that I think a lot of us are reaching towards in humanities now, is these much more capacious, wider ranging projects. So now we have to come up with a couple of names in English for Hong Yuan.
Yes, please do. Thank you, Deborah. If anybody can suggest any novels that I'm not sure but could read in English, that would be much appreciated. While you're doing that, I was just reflecting on the earlier question from Natalie about that kind of chicken and egg situation about which comes first, legislative change or cultural shifts. And although this is not my area of work, I have done a lot of work on the suffrage movement. In fact, my PhD many years ago was on a sociological analysis of the Irish suffrage movement. And you really come up against that kind of chicken and egg question very much there as well, with votes for women, with any kind of major seismic shift of attitudes and practices and legislation in society. It's what comes first. Do you have to change the attitudes of people that say, oh yes, actually women should have the right to vote? Or do you first of all need to change the law so that it has to become a fact in society, and then attitudes begin to change? And I think there is no easy answer there. These are processes that often have to go in tandem, and it's the cultural shift often happens first to some extent, even if it's only partial, and that's where the lobbying and the social movements and the pressure comes from. And then gradually you get a political change, and sometimes there's quite a time lag. I mean, women in this country, in Britain, were campaigning for the vote really for 60, 70 years before they finally were successful. So there's a long time lag there to get political change to follow some of this cultural shift. And then only when the political change has happened do you kind of get the rest of society to gradually begin to accept that these norms and practices are changing. So it's, from a sociological perspective, these are complex processes that have to happen in unison, but you're never going to get one to just happen and then the other follows. They always need to go sort of in tandem with baby steps, and it can take a very, very long time. So thank you, Deborah. Deborah's been suggesting books, so that's great. Thank you for that. So it's now coming up to nearly 7:20 here in the UK. So would anybody else like a question? And of course, you are welcome to put your hand up and turn your microphone on and simply ask a question. Maria?
I think we said something about, we said at the beginning that Megan would say a couple of words
yes,
about.
You're quite Megan. Yes, so now is a good opportunity to hand over to Megan. Thank you for reminding me.
Okay,
Megan.
I'll try to. I turned on my mic and turned on my video, so I hope everyone can see and hear me. Just a very brief few words. My name is Megan Milan. I'm the commissioning editor for Thomas's, and Thomas's is an academic publisher specializing in Hispanic and Lusophone studies. And I would just like to tell people how they can order a copy of the book. And you can see online there's the link to the book's webpage, or if you go into the Thomas's website and then the series Violence in the Hispanic Lusophone Worlds, you can click buy the book, and then as part of entering the information, enter the code and you'll get a 40% discount. So I'm sure that people will want to follow up on the issues that have been raised here. So do take advantage of the 40% off code. Yes, I think you'll find it very worthwhile. I mean, the speakers have said it better than I could. So Maria, I'll hand back to you.
Yes, I'm just gonna write.
I've just typed the. I've just put it in. Yeah. Oh, okay. You've put in the code as well. Yeah. Thanks, Maria. So there's a 40% discount off the book if you use that promotion code. So a very good bargain there.
Yeah.
Okay. So are there any other questions? So Maria.
Thank you.
Mabel.
Thank you. Well, I think we should just start finalizing this event, really. I mean, it's been a real pleasure. Deborah, having you is always a pleasure, of course, because, you know, like Stephen anticipated, you are very much on the topic and over the topic, and you're very much, you are an expert on this. So it's, we are very grateful that you just accepted to come and talk a bit about the book, the volume. Stephen, do you want to add something into
Well, I'd really just like to say thanks so much for everyone who's come along to talk about this, to talk about the book. I feel very honoured that we've been able to speak to you today about this book, which we, which Maria talked about, which was quite a tough book to write, actually, for a variety of reasons, including COVID-19. And it's really, but to come back to the event today, I think it really is wonderful also to have Deborah here to talk about the general context of women's writing. And these are, it's not that they're drops in the ocean, they're very important novels, but there is a whole world out there, as it were, of this type of writing. And we picked on a number of works that we saw as symptomatic of certain countries and tried to look into the cultural specificities. But they are really gripping sort of novels. So our aim, as much as that, is to get people to read them as well, and to talk about them and write reviews about them and blog about them, etc. So, but just to say thanks again, and also to Megan as well for coming along, and thanks so much to Louise as well, presenting things, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Deborah, would you like to say a few final words?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here in London, albeit from the comfort of my office. And I look forward to the day when we get to collaborate again. And I'm really looking forward to continuing conversations with Maria and Stephen now that Stephen and I have been able to reconnect.
Yes. No, that's lovely, Deborah. Thank you so much, and Stephen, thank you so much for coming along today. It's been a pleasure working with you in this book, and Megan, it's been lovely to work with you too. And Támesis, again, this is my second book with you, and this is part of a series actually that Vidal, you know Vidal, Luis, and I, we are leading. With Támesis, which is violence in the Hispanic and Lusophone worlds. So this is lovely to just contribute to this series and work with Támesis and with Stephen and Deborah. Let's be in touch. I'm in touch with some of your students, documentary makers and journalists, for some of the things that we are developing in the center. And for everybody listening to us today, just check out the website, the Global Diversities Center, because we are organizing many events. Actually, Deborah, we may organize something next academic year with you, a seminar or something.
Why not? Sure.
Why not? Let's be in touch with your university, because you're running several projects. Now I'm doing my lobbying thing, Louise.
Right. Well,
yes, we should.
We should
turn off the recorder.
In, Maria, is one that I'm doing with my colleague Juan Manuel Aldape Munoz.